Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's program and webinar, part of the highly acclaimed series of webinars that ACP, the Association of Contingency Planners, presents for both current and future members. For more information about ACP, visit www.acp-international.com. My name is Ed Goldberg, and it's my pleasure to host today's ACP webinar. My thanks to Gianna Martinelli and ACP's headquarters staff at ADG in Albany, and Fred Rogers at Continuity Housing for their roles as webinar experts who work behind the scenes to ensure that these webinars happen flawlessly. ACP's webinar sponsor, Continuity Housing, guarantees pre-negotiated hotel rooms at substantial savings for the critical employees of larger and mid-sized companies in order to help prevent a business disruption in the event of a crisis. They've created a patent-pending guaranteed employee housing program which secures and protects hotel rooms for critical personnel and their families if needed, while saving companies significant expense. Continuity Housing has a 100% success record with their deployments, and each member of their team has at least 10 years experience. If you'd like information on receiving a 30-minute analysis of your current housing plan or a strategy session about how to create a housing plan, visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. This and previous webinars are recorded and made available on the ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think who might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email along with additional information on the topical content. And please let me, Fred, or Gianna know if there's a topic or a speaker you'd like to see in a future webinar. Today's webinar is a live broadcast of the Connecticut Chapter's monthly program at the Eversource Energy campus in Berlin, Connecticut, just outside of Hartford. Today's program covers a very unique perspective for our field, business continuity in times of civil unrest. It's a very special program, and we're thrilled to make it available to such a large and diverse audience. Global business leaders gathered at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2014 predicted that bloody protests, civil unrest, and collective violence would be the most significant risks facing governments and businesses. True to their prediction, protests in Ferguson, New York, Hong Kong, and elsewhere have proved dangerous, disruptive, and challenging to civil society and business operations. An understanding of crowd psychology and crowd physics is essential to effective planning for and responding to collective actions. This 75-minute presentation will help leaders and decision makers form accurate behavioral assumptions for managing the impact of collective actions directed at their communities and organizations. Our speaker today is Steve Cremando, a clinician, educator, and behavioral science who we were honored to have back with us after a great presentation last November. Today he'll be outlining key psychological and behavioral considerations across the 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. With over 20 years of domestic and international experience, Steve's a clinician and educator specializing in crisis intervention, disaster recovery, traumatic event response, the psychology of homeland security, human factors, and emergency management business continuity planning. He's board certified in traumatic stress, a certified trauma specialist, and certified in homeland security level 3. He earned a master's degree in clinical psychology and has dedicated his career to the human aspects of emergency planning and response. Steve has developed crisis response programs for government agencies, non-government organizations, and multinational corporations. Please join me in welcoming Steve Cremando.
Thank you, Ed. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for joining me, and especially here at the Connecticut chapter for having me back again. And it's good to see some familiar faces. This topic, when we talk about group, crowd, and mob behavior, I based my idea really on 2 assumptions. We'll touch on them further in just a few moments, which is this sort of thing can happen anywhere. You can think about a town like Ferguson, of course, a large city like New York. And in the climate we are today, emotionally charged climate, these events can happen very spontaneously. So I'm working with one assumption, that there's really not a jurisdiction or a location that's somehow immune from potentially having protests or riots or large-scale events of this sort. The type of thing I'm going to refer to as collective action, and very specifically about collective violence as we move through the program. That's my first fundamental assumption. The second is that most professionals, and this is across disciplines, I speak often to law enforcement organizations, government organizations, military as well as the private sector, that most professionals across our disciplines have never had any formal classroom training in understanding group, crowd, and mob dynamics. So this is a very small part of our toolkit, but when your community is challenged by some sort of protest or civil unrest, it becomes an absolutely critical skill set. So our program today is going to move pretty quickly. Please note, and Ed, I'm having a, wherever you went, a little problem advancing the slides with our clicker. Look towards there. That's all. So I'll let Ed kind of move that along. I'll mention that the program, as I said, will move quickly. You will receive all these slides on an email. And again, they're going to be in an open kind of format. There'll be a PowerPoint so you can repurpose and use some of this content. When I create this information, I really do hope that you can share it with those in your organization, and also your community, CERT teams and medical reserve teams and so forth, as well as your peers.
Where should we be?
One or two more, one more. We mentioned that people will receive their slides, and we should be right there. So as Ed mentioned in the introduction, Ed, you may be driving there. You may be sitting next to the clicker for me.
There we go.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir. Sure. As I mentioned, or Ed mentioned rather, February of 2014, global leaders at Davos had looked at the kind of portrait of risk for the coming year, 2014. And out of all the different emerging risks, they thought this, collective action, group violence, that civil protest, civil unrest, would be one of the greatest challenges. And of course, this is the year we saw Ferguson. We saw the protests in New York City after the officer-involved death of Eric Gardner. We saw so many of these events, and huge protests in Hong Kong that shut down part of the government and the business districts there as well. So they were pretty spot on in their prediction. One of the things that's changed, and I think you can appreciate this very quickly, is when we think back to other times of large-scale civil unrest, maybe in the late 60s and so forth, there was no social media. The way people are able to communicate, coordinate, and move groups is radically different today. If we think about the Arab uprising, if we think about even protests last night that shut down the Brooklyn Bridge, we know that a lot of this is coordinated, communicated via social media, via texting and other services. People have the ability to communicate and coordinate in an unprecedented way very quickly to mobilize collective action. Now, obviously, what kind of peeled the lid off of this for us last year was the officer-involved shooting in Ferguson. I was speaking in Anaheim at the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals on this topic at that time, and it was going on. This event was in full swing. It was the first phase of the Ferguson protests, and certainly much of that became destructive and disruptive in Ferguson. Some of that still goes on today, and that began to spread around the country. Very often when I speak on these atypical risks, and that's kind of my area of specialization, group, crowd, and mob behavior, CBRN behavior, things of that nature, people ask, when will we see something like this? Well, it doesn't take, as I said, much creativity or much of a search of the news today to see examples that have gone on in places like Ferguson. This was when we were in Anaheim again a year before, right to the gates of Disneyland. Protests there. Again, around officer-involved shootings, 2 deaths in that community in about a week's time. Hong Kong, as I mentioned, last year as well, and the same riots around these officer-involved shootings spreading throughout the country. These became violent and destructive in Berkeley. New York City, of course, following on that with the wake of the Eric Gardner decision and the decision by the courts not to indict. And last night, this is yesterday afternoon, protests in New York, again on the Brooklyn Bridge, around police violence that shut down that area, resulted in 34 arrests and 1 officer taken out by ambulance. So we are going to focus today on the more disruptive and the more dangerous aspects of crowd behavior. Now, as Ed said, my background as a behavioral scientist, very specifically, I work in an area that's called operational psychology. I work often with our partners in Health and Human Services, specifically in SAMHSA. I'm a consultant with what's known as DTAC, the Disaster Technical Assistance Center, that brings mental health to our disaster response. Much of that is around crisis counseling, but my specialty is not the application of mental health ideas for counseling. It's the application of mental health ideas for their operational value. What should you be thinking of in terms of accurate assumptions. What are people most likely to do in different disaster scenarios? What are they not likely to do in different disaster scenarios that should help inform your policies, your plans, your procedures, your exercises? Folks, I'm preaching to the choir here. You know this. Practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. If you're exercising something incorrectly, you're leading yourself down a dangerous path. If you're building exercises around anything that involves human behavior in your emergency, which would be like almost all of them, I'd imagine, you better be basing those on accurate assumptions about what people are likely to do. Today's topic will be, what are people likely to do? What are the behavioral concerns that we look at when we have large group crowds and mobs together, which is a very, very different environment. And we'll be looking at it from a very narrow lens, kind of a behavioral science focus, intended to help enhance your thinking about plans, exercises, and again, what you will do to respond to these sort of events. This is our agenda, and this is the flow. I'd like you to think about this conceptually as a bit of a funnel, where we're starting on the wide end early this afternoon and working down and becoming more narrow and more focused. The latter section of this will actually have some very, very focused strategies and recommendations for business continuity planning, things you should have in mind in the face of these kind of events. And then we're going to drill down even further to personal safety. You all, I know, are well aware of active shooter risks and the national recommendation for run, hide, fight. We give people very clear instructions what to do in a shots fired environment should that happen in our workplace. We look at this kind of aggression and violence that may come to the workplace also in the context of potentially being a workplace violence incident, but now perpetrated by, guess what, 10,000 people protesting in the street, not by the one former disgruntled employee or someone with a chip on their shoulder towards you or your personnel. So we do want you to think about what information would you share with employees to make themselves safe in a large group or crowd scenario. And I will say to you, my bottom line recommendation, if you take nothing else out of the program today, is the very final aspect, the very final block of instruction in this personal safety area. It may be information you want to share with loved ones home tonight, because all of us have the potential to be in that shopping mall, that ball game, that theater when something goes wrong. You know, very often we talk about this in so many different circumstances. I believe that most in the audience are familiar with the term POD, P-O-D, in public health emergency planning, point of dispensing medication. I'd like you to visualize setting up your school gymnasium in your community as that pod, pushing out vaccine during a highly contagious disease outbreak, and the line of 200 or 300 of your closest friends and neighbors waiting for their vaccine. What does it do to that line when the first person turns around and yells out, hey, they're running out of medicine? Well, you can see how that's going to unfold. So we have this concern about where a large number of people could flash over into that aggressive or competitive mob in so many circumstances. As I said, the ball game, the movie theater, the shopping mall. So some of this information is actionable today. It's information I would encourage you to share with folks, how to make themselves safe if something goes wrong in a large crowd environment. So we're going to move through that funnel from the broader concepts to the very actionable ideas as we go. As I said, we're going to try to save Q&A towards the end of the program to kind of keep the flow. And as you'll see, we have an awful lot of content to share with you. I will, throughout the program, be speaking about the more adverse and, of course, the more dangerous and disruptive aspects of crowd behavior. I know, and the science in this area bears this out, that certainly the vast majority of crowds are peaceful. They're assembled for very legitimate purposes. As I said, it could be from something like a ball game to a protest, and most of them don't go wrong. But what should we know about the potential of these groups to go wrong and become dangerous and disruptive? So here, please hold on to the idea that I'm not in any way criticizing or challenging our protected rights to assemble, for free speech, and so forth. And I know, and I hope you know, that certainly not all crowds are going to be violent, but that will be our focus. My invitation to you then, as experienced business continuity planners, is the 3 A's. There will be some new information to adopt. There will be some new ideas, hopefully, you have not heard before. I'm confident in that to take home. More important, though, is the adapt, is to think about what you're doing now, the plans you've written, the ways that you've put your your strategies together and hold them against some of the ideas I'm sharing in terms of the behavioral realities. What do people do? What should we expect if we do have large groups or crowds? So it's going to require perhaps some modification of your thinking, and that's the adapt. But lastly, where the rubber meets the road, it's apply. If all of this, again, is just generally interesting to you or maybe even just mildly interesting to you, and you don't do anything with it, well, there's no true benefit out of this. So my invitation about apply is sooner rather than later. While it's on your mind, while these cases are in the news, look at your plans, especially things like your violence prevention plans, and consider, is there an aspect that talks about collective violence? Or do we only envision the one violent individual, or perhaps the one or two violent individuals? What would we do in a large group, crowd, or mob situation? Now I'm going to talk about how we've worked with some of our clients over time as well, some of their challenges with this behavior, groups, crowds, and mobs. As I said, but the program today is very much tailored for you. For the experienced business continuity planner, very often we have mixed audiences of folks who have a security focus, risk management, crisis management focus, but really the ideas are behavioral concepts intended to improve your continuity plans around this level of disruption. So as I said, the two assumptions that these are built on is that all of us potentially face this challenge. Regardless, as I said, can be in that high school gym that we stand up as a shelter or we stand up as a pod. Never mind the large civil unrest incident in your community, and that most of us probably have not had any formal classroom education. So if that is accurate, if I'm accurate in those assumptions, let this be the first. Let this be the first kind of sit-down discussion you've had of these behaviors. Bottom line is we look at our objectives, though, consistent to all of my work, helping you form accurate behavioral assumptions to guide your efforts. So let's jump in then and start to think about how we can address our vulnerabilities to group, crowd, and mob behavior, protect assets and personnel, increase our awareness, and minimize danger, which will be at the heart of everything we share. What we know from a behavioral science standpoint in emergency management is when we get this wrong, when we get the people piece of this wrong, it can render our plans ineffective, sometimes inappropriate, meaning we underreact or overreact to the circumstance, and in some ways even dangerous to our personnel, dangerous to those around us in the community. It is critical then to get the people piece right. When I spoke here, I believe it was in November, the topic for the day was on human factors. Myself and my colleague, Cynthia Simeone, we presented on human factors in business continuity with an idea that these are key behavioral concepts really all of us should have. So here again, we're trying to improve our odds of getting the people piece right, and we'll start with this fundamental concept. Dr. Kurt Lewin was thought to be the father of social psychology, and Lewin had said that human behavior is a function of both the person and the environment. There are characteristics about the individual, personality traits, there may be cultural and ethnicity, there may be, again, age and gender. There's so many things that go into the person, but there's also a lot about the environment. And as these collide, and think about that, because that's really where the power comes from. If you think about maybe the book and movie from Sebastian Junger, Perfect Storm, right? The thing that made it a perfect storm was the collision of these forces. So it's the collision of these forces, individual traits and traits of the environment, that give rise to any behavior. But for our behavior today that we're discussing, group, crowd, and mob behavior, would you agree with me that being in a large crowd is a different environment? And people may be capable of or willing to do different things in that large crowd than they otherwise would not do. So we have a very unique environment. And certainly I can't speak to the person, any one individual in a crowd of hundreds, thousands. Hey, we're going to talk in a few moments about the Hajj, the annual Mecca pilgrimage to Mecca, routinely draws between 2 and 3 million pilgrims for that event. So we can't speak with high degrees of confidence about the individual, but we can say with some degree of certainty what sort of environments, what sort of groups, crowds, and mobs will bring about different behavior that we can use, again, operationally to guide our plans. So please hold on to this concept as being central to everything I share with you. We're going to talk about the environment, but also some of the people factors in there as well. When we think then about group, crowd, and mob behavior, what I refer to in a general way as collective behavior, This certainly can arise in many, many different situations. We do have civil unrest, protests, sometimes riots in the wake of disasters. We'll talk later about what we call acquisition mobs. These may be people trying to get something. So food riots, water riots, people competing to get into shelters, things of this nature are possible, and we've seen them in large-scale disasters. We could see this in the wake of terrorism. For example, the opposite concept, which is known as an escape mob. Rather than running towards something, which is an acquisition mob, trying to get things, these are folks running away. Sarin nerve gas attack, Tokyo subway, March of 1995, produced a 4-to-1 ratio of behavioral casualties to medical casualties. Larger scale event, Goiânia, Brazil, September 1987, produced a 500-to-1 ratio of behavioral casualties to medical casualties and completely overwhelmed that government's ability to manage the emergency. So here, again, we know, depending on the nature of the event, not just a disaster, but if it's something atypical like a CBRN, sometimes in other invisible threats like disease outbreaks, we'll get an escape mob sort of response, and I'll define that further in just a little bit. A different dynamic, but still potentially dangerous and disruptive to our operations. Political and civil unrest, such as we saw in the Arab Spring, what was referred to as the American Autumn in the fall of 2011 with Occupy Wall Street. And also we're going to talk a little bit about mass crime. We're going to talk about flash mobs for just a few moments. We're going to talk about the London riots, also in August of 2011, and what those were about and the implications for us as planners. But we look at disasters, again, 3 key concepts. As disasters potentially creating crowds. Will you agree with that concept? Disasters can create crowds? Crowds can create disasters. I'm going to give you a great example of that in just a moment. My perspective, not all crowds are violent, but I do believe all crowds are potentially dangerous, and for the primary reason of the physics and the psychology of crowds and how they interact. And I'm going to share why I feel that way. So I don't want to go in kind of from a paranoid or frightened standpoint, but I do want to have a good sense of the potential danger that may simply arise from having a large number of people together. And we'll talk about the factors that underlie that. As I said, the dangerousness of crowds arises out of the combination of 2 very significant forces, the psychological forces and the physiological forces, the physics of crowds, and as these interact with each other. So it's not one or the other, it's how they interact and how they actually fuel each other that can create that situation. So let's talk then about the most fundamental ideas about what are groups, crowds, and mobs. How do we understand those? In what circumstances do they arise? And what are the behavioral factors we should understand about those? Again, when we look around at the nature of events, labor actions in Wisconsin, large civil unrest, entertainment events. This is the Love Festival in Duisburg, Germany. That sounds nice, doesn't it, the Love Festival? It sounds really sweet. 21 people died in stampedes at the concert when there was mixed messages about how to get in and out of a specific tunnel. So routinely at large venues of this sort, we have that potential. Shopping. This is the Walmart in Valley Stream, Long Island. You remember that on Black Friday now, about 4 years ago. I was involved in the response to that. I got a very good look at that situation. And the thing I want you to know about that stampede and the death of that individual working at Walmart was he was not simply stampeded over. And that's not the way most people are hurt or killed in large-scale crowd crush scenarios. I'm going to describe crowd crush further as we go. But look at the front of this building. If you can see how the front door is this large kind of steel and glass structure, that was pushed in by the crowd. He was trapped underneath that, and the crowd walked over him. He was crushed under that. The force of the crowd, what I mentioned before is the physics of crowds, completely ripped that off its moorings. He was trapped underneath. So we're talking about extreme force, even in a crowd that's not aggressive, even in a crowd that's not violent. The sheer numbers of so many people in one place. And even if the people in the front row are not pushing, the people in the back might be. And that force multiplies. So here again, we have so many different potential crowd scenarios. And I did mention the Hajj before, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, thought to be an obligation once in a life for every able-bodied Muslim man and woman. Gathers, as I said, millions each time this occurs. Now we also have, beyond those traditional scenarios, kind of an evolution. And as I said, part of what's fueled the evolution in crowd behavior is social media. The term flash mob, when it began, was something that was very playful. So here you see National Pillow Fight Day, right? Back in 2008. And we saw silent discos, and we saw all kinds of just kind of fun, goofy behavior that would appear to be very spontaneous. So a number of people having communicated by social media or text, converging in a park, and all doing something similar, and again, being playful. The term flash mob, though, has become more ominous over time. Here in 2011, we see one of our officers being dragged out of the events, the riots there in London. Flash mob today typically means groups, crowds, or mobs that have been organized and have been mobilized through social media. Now that obviously happens at light speed. And there was a time in law enforcement, a time in emergency management, where primarily only the good guys had radios. So here, when we think about it, everybody today is carrying in their pocket kind of a full studio, aren't they? We can take photographs, video recordings, voice recordings. We can post a video. We can communicate so quickly. And the way that we can fuel that contagion of a crowd is very different than it was in decades past. So the term here, flash mob, again, when we use that, unfortunately has taken somewhat of a sinister turn, and it's usually referring to something negative, something adverse. We also know a smaller manifestation of this, a real concern for individuals at the National Retail Federation, are flash robs, which are individuals who coordinate and mobilize to descend upon a shopping outlet, so here in a mall, here in a store, usually to kind of, smash and grab high-end goods, so purses, watches, jewelry, things of this nature, in such large numbers and so quickly that mall security, law enforcement can't effectively respond. These people can descend, rob, and disappear back into the crowd so quickly that it's become very hard to defend against that in a number of different settings. National Retail Federation has published some great guidelines, and if you or any of your affiliates do work in the retail kind of sector, really good guidance on how to defend and how to reduce the likelihood of flash rob scenarios. So onto the traditional kind of models of crowd behavior, especially, as I said, our topic today, adverse crowd behavior. We've added some of those flash capacities, flash mob, flash rob, and others, understanding the new tool that individuals in the crowd have. If you don't recall it accurately, or kind of a distant memory at this point for most of us, the riots in late August in London, now in 2011. This began, guess what, on the heels of an officer-involved death of a suspect who was picked up. And the very first blush of it, it looked like kind of traditional civil unrest, people protesting against police brutality. That was day one of the event. As this evolved over the next several days, it became something totally different. This became essentially a large-scale crime of opportunity. On the worst night of the riot, there were 2,200 fires burning in London simultaneously. London PD called in more than 10,000 officers from surrounding jurisdictions to suppress those riots that went on for more than a week. It resulted in tens of millions of property damage. It resulted in injuries and death. So here, some of the things we understood is after it moved through that initial phase of kind of public unrest associated with the officers involved killing of the suspect, these were the messages we're starting to see on cell phones and BlackBerries confiscated by the rioters. If you're down for making money, we're about to go hard in East London. Guys, that's not a civil unrest message, is it? That's not a political uprising. And this one, better yet, everyone in Edmonton, Enfield, everyone in the north, link up at Enfield Town Station at 4. Bring cars, vans, also hammers, link up and cause havoc. They're spelling that line. Just rob everything. The police can't stop it. And they were right. The police could not stop it because what they found was most of these, and these were primarily youth, late adolescents, were using BlackBerry as their primary cell phone. And in the UK in that time, BlackBerry was one of the more popular cell phones for adolescents. We think of it primarily as a business tool or a government tool, was very popular with kids. And through using the proprietary BlackBerry messenger service, local police and intelligence could not penetrate, could not follow that movement. these protesters were able to communicate and stay one step ahead of the police for an entire week. It was playing whack-a-mole. So they had debriefings with PD in London. We would show up at this corner. They seemed to have found out a moment before and disappeared. And we'd move to the next corner and the next corner. And the London PD just had the most awful time getting a handle on these riots. So we have seen this in a large-scale sort of event. And very interesting, when we look at civil unrest and protests, in the London incident, about 40% of those who had been arrested had come from more than an hour or more away to participate, got back on the train and went home at the end of the day. So we have rioting commuters, which is a new phenomena and kind of an outgrowth of social media and the way we can communicate. People who can cast a much wider net and say, hey, this is going to go down tonight in Hartford. It's going to go down tonight in Brooklyn. Come and join. Come and be part of that. And that wasn't possible, again, a decade or so ago, at least not in the very same way. When we look at this concept of social unrest, by definition, you'll notice here from the Encyclopedia Britannica, this condition known as social unrest can, it very often does, lead to violence. Now, when we think about the civil unrest part, kind of the political uprising or the social concept, and that's not always going to be part of our equation, it usually arises out of one of three different areas, and these are not mutually exclusive. These can commingle somewhat. Some may be country-specific. So here, we're in Tahrir Square, and protesters essentially draw a line in the sand, and they say, we are not going until President Mubarak is gone. And they got their way, didn't they? Changed kind of history in the Middle East through this effort. So it could be national. It could be political in that way. It could be company-specific. A lot of the companies I work with are life science companies. And protesters very often are there because of things like GMOs, about experimenting on animals, upon environmental impact, in which the extremists may feel justified in targeting people or property of a company because they feel, again, that they're damaging the environment or hurting animals in some way. So it could be specific to a company, and it could be both. It can be project-specific, either from the government or from a company, but there's some action that people are protesting. We'll talk more about some examples of that as we go. But I've used these terms a few times now, groups, crowds, and mobs, and what's really important, I guess, from my standpoint, is for us to have a clear understanding of what these are and how they're different. A fundamental flaw in response, whether response is in company planning or it's in police response to a large group or crowd, is the idea that we have a one-size-fits-all. When we have large numbers of people, this is what we do. I am pretty confident in the statement that if you have that one-size-fits-all, there will be many instances in which you are overreacting to the crowd and you're fueling the fire, that you will be what escalates, or our community response will be what escalates the tension and the violence potential in the crowd. There are also as many instances in which we may underreact because we're not reading the crowd right, and until it actually flashes over into a violent mob, we may not understand its violence potential. We may act too slowly to intervene and help manage that. Now, I'm using that term very specifically, manage that, because when we talk about crowd management, the first thing that typically comes to mind for people is the expression crowd control. You've all heard that, right? Crowd control is reactive. Crowd management is proactive. Crowd management means we wait to see what the crowd's doing and then we move in as a countermeasure and try to change that behavior. Crowd management is the idea that we try to anticipate the crowd behavior and do things ahead of time that may reduce the likelihood of adverse crowd behavior. So I'm using the term crowd management in a very, very specific way as we move through this section of the discussion. So at the most fundamental level, when we talk about crowds, a simple crowd is a small number of people temporarily gathered. They usually have no formal leadership, but they do have pre-existing bonds. And that's the thing that may bring some aspect of difficulty, disruption, or dangerousness to the equation. Let me give you a common, but unfortunately uncommon, sadly uncommon, but powerful and sad kind of scenario. You have a situation tonight in your community of a young person who was killed in a motor vehicle accident, and large numbers of friends and family show up at the hospital emergency department. Is that quite possible? So here again, very spontaneous, not a huge crowd, fairly spontaneous, no formal leadership, but many of these people, because they are friends and family, they have a pre-existing relationship. Agreed? Therefore, an offense against one is perceived as an offense against them all. And they're very likely to hang tough, especially if they're emotionally charged, hang together again, and because they are moving in this very bonded way, this loyalty, this pre-existing bond, this can represent a challenge to us if we're trying to move, if we're trying to influence that crowd. That's not true in other sorts of groups. When we move from a simple group to a crowd, a larger crowd, the crowd by definition is a larger number of people, also temporarily congregated, but in most instances, members of the crowd continue to act as individuals. There's no leadership, there's no bond between them, they all just happen to be in this place. Now, yes, there are different sorts of crowds. Key feature in a crowd in general is the lack of leadership. So there's not one person for us to talk to. There's not a coordinating group for us to negotiate with. They have no clear leadership. They just all happen to be there, as I said. But there are different sorts of crowds. And this is where it becomes important, moving away from a one-size-fits-all model. What should I know about the crowd? What kind of crowd is it? Helps us shape our response. So we think about a few different sorts of crowds. The first is the casual crowd. The casual crowd may be those shoppers gathered outside that store on Black Friday, waiting to get in for the big sale or whatever the desirable items are. They also have no leadership, but they are revved up. Agreed? They've been waiting there for hours, maybe a day or more. They're all energized. They're pumped up. So they come with a higher level of emotion, not necessarily negative emotion, but a higher level of emotion. In fact, as I move through the different types of groups, crowds, and mobs, I'd like you to kind of visualize a thermometer in which we're moving from the cooler crowds to the hotter crowds, to the potentially more explosive crowds. So the coolest of these would be that casual crowd. No purpose, no leadership, again, fairly spontaneous, and a high degree of emotion, but not necessarily negative emotion. As we move to a cohesive crowd, we see a different dynamic. And that dynamic is while they still lack leadership, they do have a bond and they have a higher degree of emotion, some sort of passion. So they all love this team. They all love that band. Whatever brought them together, the concert, the game, working right now, for example, with the city of Philadelphia and planning for the Pope's visit. People come with a passion, something they share. There's not a leader. Again, there's not one person for us to talk and negotiate with. They may be more emotional than the casual crowd, but still it may be a positive emotion. When we go up that grid, when we go up to the higher levels of emotion now, we talk about an expressive crowd, which comes out primarily to ventilate. They have a very high degree of emotion. They are true believers in something, whatever their cause is. So it's political, perhaps. It's pro-life, it's pro-choice. It's whatever their strongly held belief is. They want to let people know they're assembling in numbers. They very often do have leadership, very often have charismatic leadership that wants to kind of whip them up and have them feel a sense of unity. We are all believers. We are all passionate about this cause. But their motive very often is simply to be heard. It's simply to get out there, to make their cause visible and known to the larger community. But their emotion is usually a little stronger and more often an angry or an aggressive sort of emotion. Because of their passion, again, they're pushing back against others who do not believe, do not feel the same way that they do. So emotion's a little higher in this instance. But the more dangerous form of crowd, where it's kind of closer to the boiling point, this is what we refer to as the aggressive crowd. And the aggressive crowd comes out. They assemble already predisposed to bring a higher level of energy, of anger, and sometimes of physical violence to their situation. They have actually drawn a line in the sand. They are not going to back down until they achieve a very specific goal. And this is the sort of crowd that's closest to flashing over into a mob. So if I'm looking last night at several hundred people walking across the bridge in Brooklyn, This is somewhere between the expressive crowd who's rallying against police brutality and somewhere in between the aggressive crowd who is ready to rumble and actually attack the police officer who got out of his car, off-duty officer, to see how he could help in the situation when they identified that he was an officer. So the crowd comes with a predisposition to use violence if necessary. Now, this is close to the boiling point. This is up there on that scale. And they may not flash over into the angry, hostile, or dangerous mob. But the things that do tend to flash or to ignite that crowd into a mob we refer to as flashpoints. And the flashpoints arrive out of a number of different circumstances, common, and there can be others as well. And I want to mention just a few. Last night, of course, and what we've seen in the recent police protests, whether it's been from Ferguson to Staten Island to Brooklyn last night, was perception of, real or imagined, perception of excessive or inappropriate use of force. The reason here is the protester feels a sense of justification. The gloves are off. The police are using pepper spray. The police are being more physical and aggressive. Therefore, we're justified in being as physical and as aggressive in response. That's one flashpoint. That's one of the most common. Denial of access. Remember my scenario before about people lined up for a vaccine? So here's this. I saw this case actually in a flu outbreak about a decade ago. Young mom, 2 small kids carrying in her arms. She stood in line for more than an hour outside in the snow on a cold winter day for that vaccine. Hours in the line, finally got inside, about 15 people from the desk, and she was told they just ran out of medicine. You can imagine her reaction, okay? So here, denial of access, whether it's purposeful, no, you can't come in, you don't have the right ticket, you don't have the right pass, and think of your pandemic plans. Think of pandemic planning. And we have to prioritize who gets vaccine first and second. People who are told, no, you can't come in, you can't have that, whatever the denial of access is, that invites a certain person to push back, doesn't it? That invites some of that behavior. Perceived breach of rules, number 2 and number 6 are very close together since you've been the littlest kid. Someone cutting in line will bring about that reaction. Hey, it's not fair. Why are they getting an unfair advantage? Now, that also can happen on a much larger level. So if we see perceived abridgment of rights, you heard this in the wake of Katrina. Why are certain classes, socioeconomic, racial, and otherwise, why are they getting preferential treatment? Why are others not? That will bring about this kind of reaction, people who feel they need to fight back. And as I say, when we are perceived as having a lack of organization, it invites others to step in and try to fill that vacuum. These are the common flashpoints that will transition a crowd to a mob. The mob is different. The mob now is that crowd who has lost any regard for consequences. They no longer care if they're arrested, if they're hurt, if property is destroyed. So here, that disregard, I think it was Confucius who said, beware the man who has nothing to lose. So this disregard for consequences raises the stakes. And these are folks then who are, again, instilled with an intense sense of purpose and willing to risk those, risk those consequences if things go wrong. That, again, is a basic description of the crowds, the groups, the mobs, and so forth. But there are different kinds of mobs, and I did mention a few earlier on. The first of these being the aggressive mob. That's the London riots. After the first day, when there was kind of a political motive about the officer-involved death, that just became looting and vandalism and arson and crimes of opportunity. So that became large-scale mass crime. Aggressive crowds, race riots, political riots, prison riots, all kind of fall in that category. Is different than an escape mob. Now, for folks who are with us in November, I spent a few moments talking about panic and emergencies. And I want to digress just for a moment to bring that back into our discussion. Panic is actually unlikely in most disasters. Okay? What drives panic in an emergency? 2 features: perception of limited opportunity for escape and perception of limited availability of critical supplies. So think of my mom back in line for vaccine for flu, right? Perception of limited availability of critical supplies. Let me give you one, though, that highlights perception of limited opportunity for escape. So here's a bridge in Baghdad. It's August 2005, and a huge religious pilgrimage is moving through the city of Baghdad and has to cross this one bridge, and people start bottlenecking up. They all, again, get ganged up on this bridge. And someone on the bridge thinks they see wires hanging from someone's backpack, yells out there's a suicide bomber on the bridge. In the stampede to get off the bridge, 965 people are killed. Guess what? No bomber. Just perception of limited opportunity for escape. Remember one of my early concepts? Disasters can create crowds, but crowds can create disasters. Here we have a mass casualty event, nearly 1,000 people killed, purely by human behavior, just from the stampede. There was no other hazard. Perceived limited opportunity for escape. So that brings us to our example of an escape mob. Rather than moving towards something, which is an acquisitive or an acquisition mob, which may be food, water, shelter, and the like, rather than trying to get something, they're trying to get away. Very interesting. I believe it's Columbia University has done some great computer modeling on human behavior and movement during emergencies. It's a computer model they refer to as Plan C. And Plan C, some of it is based on the attacks of sarin in Tokyo, the Goiânia event I mentioned, looking how New Yorkers would evacuate the subway system in a similar event if nerve gas or some hazard was released on the New York subway system. So we could look at how people would flow and how they would move away, how they would try to escape. But that same escape, it represents a real risk to safety. So let me give you an operational idea. When we train business continuity planners in security in shopping malls are very keyed in on the aspect of active shooters, which they should be, agreed? One of the things we tell mall management is, you're thinking about the people who are being shot. That's a critical and an important priority. You will have as many or more people hurt trying to get down the escalators and get down the stairs, pushing, falling, tripping, and landing on top of each other. So if you're thinking about how will we manage the medical impact of an active shooter event, yes, you have to think about those who may be shot. You need to think about all those other who are hurt attempting to flee from that shots fired environment. So we'll think about how that cascades outward from a behavioral standpoint. So here are three different types of mobs: aggressive, escape mob, acquisition mobs, all a little bit different. And as I said, this is actually a photograph of that religious pilgrimage starting to move across the bridge in Baghdad that results in those 965 deaths. Now that, of course, was accidental. That wasn't purposeful as far as we know. But we also know that some groups will bring violence to bear as part of a strategy. When I have an opportunity, I like to show videos about anarchist and black bloc movement. Very, very interesting dynamic that we see in some crowds, in some large protests, and I want to share just a few concepts about that. When we see crowds become or consider the use of violence, and the reason I bring up anarchists, if you're not familiar, part of the anarchist philosophy is no social change is possible without violence. So we assume when we see anarchists insert themselves as agitators into another large group or crowd that the violence potential escalates dramatically. The two factors that drive violence, though, are a sense of legitimacy, and as I said before, that's a justification that because the authorities are brutal or excessively forceful or unfair in some way, we're legitimate in the use of our violence as a problem-solving tool. But the other is projection of power. And I'll give you another example of that in just a moment. On Occupy Wall Street, and I had the good fortune of working on Occupy Wall Street as an observer with police all the way from Occupy Montreal down to Occupy Atlanta. So I've seen this, again, in action in a number of different venues. But projection of power, for example, is the group who wants to project that they're actually making a difference. This is a recruitment strategy, it's a retention strategy, it's a mobilization strategy. So what did Wall Street or Occupy Wall Street project during their time of reign, pretty much fall of 2011? Some of the things they claimed credit for was an overhaul of the mortgage industry. I don't think it was all due to Occupy Wall Street. Refusing to leave the parks, yep, that's legitimate. They were named, and that should be 2011, excuse the typo, Person of the Year by Time Magazine. And they took credit for the change. Banks were just about to push up ATM fees to $5 for driving it back down to 2 or 3. But one I know is accurate is in Chicago, the G8 was scheduled for the following spring, right on the heels of the NATO summit there. And the city of Chicago, law enforcement, emergency management said very clearly to the federal government, please don't do this. And the G8 was moved to Camp David. They had such a large-scale protest and such an insertion of anarchists at the NATO summit, and it became so violent that they simply did not want to do that again only weeks later. So they did force the relocation of the G8 summit in that year. From the protest standpoint, when we're talking about something that's a more organized protest, as much as Occupy Wall Street really prided itself on being a leaderless movement, I could tell you, and those in the intelligence community can tell you, it was not leaderless. The leaderless were very back, far from the lines, while the campers are freezing their tushies off in Zuccotti Park. The leaders are uptown in some pretty nice hotels. But these are well-trained and well-schooled agitators who produce videos, who produce training manuals, who produce things like the Occupy Wall Street Journal once every few weeks. Very well funded, very well mobilized again. And part of their strategy is they're not going to criticize, at least openly and publicly, the use of aggression or violence by any other faction. It's all fair game. In fact, look at the title, Not Violent, Nonviolent, and Not Nonviolent. That's a little interesting, play on words, but that is the mindset. It says violence is a legitimate problem-solving tool when you're trying to create social change. If you're not familiar with anarchists in general as kind of a splinter of thinking of socialism, the main line of thought in anarchism is that all hierarchy in government, in schools, in our communities works against human potential. Therefore, the motto of the anarchist is there's no government like no government. There just simply should not be any sort of structure. Now, some of the tactics used in large-scale protests, and these have a business application because, folks, what that protester wants is a photo op of your security, of your personnel behaving badly, to post online, to help drive this sense of justification. So here again, that's the concept of forced arrest, that the protester is going to do something that leaves the officer no choice but to arrest them. And that looks bad, right? Especially if it involves force or pepper spray or anything else. So here again, forced arrests are part of a larger strategy that's very sophisticated and very complex at this point. Large-scale organized protests are very, very sophisticated. As much as at the street level it could look like a collection of ragtag sort of individuals, the backstory on this is usually a lot more complicated. As I said, when we think about anarchism, we understand that they will be bringing a much different violence potential to your event. The principles, as I mentioned, is towards freedom, towards tearing down hierarchy, tearing down the structure of society. And part of the anarchist tactics is black bloc. And I only want to spend 1 or 2 slides very quickly on black bloc. Black bloc is not a group. But this feeds into our discussion in just a moment of the psychology of crowds. So it's interesting in that way. Black bloc is this idea that we're all going to dress exactly alike. So black BDUs, black hoodies, black backpack, masks, everything, again, identical, which creates a sense of anonymity. It creates a sense of solidarity, doesn't it? Now it's not 1 or 2 of us. It is us en masse. The anarchist, again, using black bloc tactics, typically comes not just dressed in a similar uniform, but carrying the same tools, slingshots, smoke bombs, spray cans, ropes and marbles. Why ropes and marbles? Trip hazard? Trip hazard for mounted patrol, for horses. Because very often officers on horseback are used for crowd management and crowd control. It's to take down the horse and the officer on their back. So these people are thoughtful and practiced in these skills. And, for example, we use very specific tactics like unarresting. Unarresting is the idea that if the police grab one of the protesters, this person now dressed head to toe in black, the crowd is going to grab them back, pull them back into the middle of the crowd where now they can't be identified. They can't be rearrested. So this is a very, very unique strategy, and we see it again. Not necessarily the anarchists create your protest, but if they see a larger protest going on, they seek to co-opt that, jump in on that, become those agitators, and change the course of that. All of that feeds into the psychology of crowds. Two of the principal, I guess, driving forces of crowds. If you remember my earlier statement about Dr. Lewin's equation, behavior is a function of the person and the environment. A different environment now, the primary driver is anonymity. No one will know it's me. No one can identify it's me. Therefore, I can't be held accountable. I won't be detained. I won't be arrested. I won't be held accountable for my behavior. These 5 individuals, this is on Maiden Lane outside the old Goldman Sachs building down towards the South Street Seaport in New York City, arrested in September 2011, all with their Guy Fawkes masks on. Why are they arrested? Statute in New York City says you can't protest with masks on. 150-year-old statute, because for decades now, centuries, we've known that people behind that cloak, behind that mask, are capable of much different behavior, aren't they? If they fail, they can't be identified and held accountable for that. That creates that sense of anonymity. No one will know it's me. We also have some other common psychological factors, and this is one of my favorite posters. I don't believe in anything. I just came for the violence. Like truthfulness and protesting. Universality and convergence are elements in groupthink. Everyone's doing it, therefore I should. Convergence is that shared vision with the group of what needs to happen. But notice the center bullet here, inability to withdraw, is something different. And we train police officers to be very vigilant of this. It's the person who keeps going along with what the crowd's doing because they're afraid if they stop, the crowd will turn on them. So that kind of fear is something a little bit different and also shapes behavior. We saw a lot of really interesting arrests in the London riots of people who were afraid not to do what the rioters were doing. Actually, a very interesting arrest of a 24-year-old woman who was a social work graduate student, stole the large screen color TV, and a day later turned herself into PD. Was arrested and charged. Didn't need it. Had a beautiful home and television at home, but she just felt like swept up by the crowd, and if she didn't do what they were doing, that she would be on the wrong side of this and she would be hurt. So a lot of ways we see these dynamics mingled through a large crowd. Social suggestion and contagion are more of the classic groupthink sorts of elements. The urge to do what others are doing if we feel we're in the same boat with them. They are like me. Therefore, again, I'm pulled along with that behavior. But contagion. And you felt contagion. You felt contagion at a rock concert, a ball game, when there's just that electric energy that moves through a crowd. And that's what we refer to, that can just sweep people away, at least psychologically. So we've talked a little bit about the psychology. And now I want to shift gears to the physics. And if you're home and work viewing this remotely, or you're here in our audience in Connecticut, these are people, not pixels. All those little dots. And here again, going back to that annual event, the Hajj in Saudi Arabia. That year, 3.4 million people showed up for the week-long event. We're going to skip the video today, but again, you can see an idea of the crowd density in that situation. What you should know, when I said dangerousness arises from the combination of these two forces, the physics of crowds and the psychology of crowds, this is the danger in the physics of this, the idea of crowd crush. Now, medically, crowd crush is referred to as compressional asphyxiation. It means the person just simply can't breathe. They are just packed so tight in that crowd. These are individuals who are hurt and some who are killed in a crowd crush at a soccer match, a football game in the UK. So we've seen this, whether it's sporting events, it's concerts, it's shopping events. It's the person who's hurt or killed simply by that human behavior, not necessarily by violence. Not that anyone tried to hurt them, but the forces, the physical forces of the crowd are so great and they get away from people so quickly, they become very, very hard to contain. So here, a few things to think about. We think most people need, for safety, at least 1 square yard around them, to ambulate, to respirate, to move comfortably. And as we start closing in, we compromise their safety. In fact, we think the force of 5 people surrounding and pressing in that person is probably enough to kill them. And in fact, when we see people die from crowd crush, most people die standing up. It's not it's not by stampede, it's not by trampling. Very often you hear this in the news. There was a riot at a football match in the UK today, and 12 people were hurt. They were stampeded or trampled to death. Upon autopsy, it's typically found that that person was dead before they hit the ground and then run over by the crowd as they try to flee. Most people who die in large crowds die on their feet, and very often are carried by the crowd who don't even know they're dead for a while. This can happen in minutes. You could be unconscious within 30 seconds. You could be dead on your feet in 6 minutes from that sort of compression asphyxiation. We don't even talk about the other factors like thermal insulation, the body heat from those folks, even in the winter, about other forces that come to play. 2 studies very quickly in a panic situation. We think 5 people capable of developing nearly 800 pounds of pressure. In this instance, horizontally, people who piled on top of each other, up to 900 pounds of pressure. Guys, you cannot breathe. With that weight on your chest, you cannot respirate. You will be unconscious pretty quickly. We also have seen instances, people lifted right off their feet, out of their shoes, clothing torn just by the force of the crowd. And as I said, people who can become unconscious, guess what? Medical very often, even knowing of someone who goes down, can't get to them through the crowd. Can't get to them, can't locate them, and can't extricate them from a crowd very quickly. So this becomes a very dangerous situation. So what do we do about that then? Let's turn the corner then in our thinking to 2 last elements of our presentation, which are about some business continuity concepts, some things to be thinking about. If you imagine, if something happens in your community or it's a pre-planned event, you know there's likely to be large groups or crowds. And lastly, that personal safety piece. And I have worked with clients, some of them on down in the kind of K Street area of D.C., in the kind of politically active part of town, who actually have given their employees on days of protest little wallet cards that give them guidance on what to do and not do to make themselves safe coming and going to the office and if they're out and about. So we're going to talk about some of those concepts as well. If we know, if we have any inkling that we may be facing large group or crowd activity, some things to think about. One is, again, what I mentioned, this from my perspective, and I know I have a unique bias on this, in your overall suite of different risks and hazards that you assess, if you think about, and I think this belongs with your violence prevention plans, is there mention about violence directed towards your personnel, your organization, that's coming from more than one person, that's coming from a group, or that injury may occur from simply the large number of people in and around your property in some type of protest. So how do we make sure that's woven in to your overall violence prevention, your overall safety efforts? Obviously, this is going to be an event that requires a high degree of coordination with your local first responder community. So I'm preaching to the choir here about the importance of ICS, of Incident Command System, and NIMS training, so you understand the interoperability, how to interact with the command structure, because what your organization does obviously needs to be done in concert with what the locals are doing in terms of managing and responding to this event. That includes sharing intel that you may be getting, directed at your website, directed at your personnel, that something is coming. Very often, large protests like to let you know they're coming. They want to use that kind of fear factor. They want to shape and change your behavior. So if you're getting intel, is it something you want to share with your locals? If the locals are getting intel about the possibility of crowds, very often can that be shared with us? We'll get that in New York. We'll get that from Seattle. The protesters, a number of them who are known identified agitators, are leaving tomorrow on a train, on a plane, and they're coming to New York. What's going on in New York? So here again, how do we share intelligence between public and private partners? Also providing information, as I said, and training to the workforce, whether it's that wallet card, it's on your website, it's ad hoc during a protest, about how to make themselves safe. Down in the Wall Street area, speaking before about being at the Federal Reserve, of course, when we had the events of 2011, if you were someone identified wearing an ID tag from the banks, from the stock exchange and so on, you're probably the minimum going to be spit on trying to get in and out of there. I was on the receiving end of that myself once or twice. So here again, how do we prepare our workforce? As I said, for active shooter, we teach people today how to run, hide, and fight. Is there something they should know about making themselves safe in a large, aggressive sort of crowd? Coordinate communications, obviously ours and theirs with the locals in terms of the release of information, so we're not contradicting, we're not confusing our messages about this. Think about insider threat. Think about the employee or employees who may be sympathizers with the cause. And now your company is saying, hey, on Thursday we're adjusting something about traffic or parking or entrance ways or times that we're coming and going that day because of the protest. And now you have someone on the inside who says, yeah, I need to share that with the rest of the true believers. So how will you address insider threat and people who sympathize with the cause? As I said, information on best practices with trade groups. I gave you the idea of the National Retail Federation information designed for the retail industry. So at the executive level, top tier, C-suite sort of information, is our plan up to date and in place? Is our basic notification structure, whatever technology you use, however you do that, is it in place? If we need to trigger our emergency preparedness and response plan, can we do that quickly? Senior citizens, do senior leaders know their off-site EOC? Because if you can't get to the building, they all, of course, have to be versed into where to meet, all this kind of standard BCP actions. Are there essential functions that can be done off-site if we can't get to our buildings? So all the things we would think about other sorts of disruption to operations, how are they in play? Things like supply chain and so forth, are they in place for this sort of event? Might we trigger a work from home or an alternate site mentality for this kind of event if people can't safely get to and from our buildings because of crowds? And again, will insurances cover losses, not only due to business disruption, but to property damage that arises out of large group behavior? There's some executive level thinking. For our mid-level managers, people managers, training sessions for employees in general about your emergency response plan, what are employees' responsibilities, what's available to them in terms of resources. Those are things we do all the time, of course. We talked about the alternate work site ideas for certain employees. How will a large group or crowd event affect attendance if they can't get to work? Do they use a personal day? Do they call in sick? What's the model you use if that is the reason they can't get to the office today? And again, maybe looking at things like flexible work schedules if that's a possible antidote to the disruption caused by a crowd. For folks, again, charged specifically with business continuity and security, we think about these ideas in terms of your hazard assessment. So before an event, as you think about all the other potential hazards that may affect your organization, is this one you've thought about? Are you vulnerable to this? Is your organization one that may draw the ire of protest? Even if you have nothing to do with the protest, if you're along a common pathway that may be occupied by protesters. So last night, if we watched people coming across the Manhattan Bridge on the Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, all those little shops, they have nothing to do with the protest. No one's shopping tonight. You can't get to them. You can't leave work. You're stuck there. So from a continuity planning standpoint, have we thought about that as one of our vulnerabilities? Again, alternate operating strategies. And is this something that we can task to people to be the monitors of both mainstream news and also social media, what we're putting out, what we're hearing in social media? So, of course, a very key interoperable part here with your communications team, but also being vigilant to what the larger media is saying about the nature of protests. You also notice here protests that may compromise the transportation system. If certain train lines, if certain routes are closed because they're anticipating protests or rallies, how will that affect your operations as well? A few others, though, in closing out this section, are coordinating, of course, with local companies and neighbors. If you're in a crowded district of town that may be affected by a protest, what are the other surrounding businesses doing? Is it something you could do together to create more of a unified strategy? You don't want to be blindsided by the other companies doing something radically different that may either increase or change the risk profile. Maybe changing your security posture. Maybe it's increasing the number of uniformed guards so you have a more visible presence. Thinking about things like that. Of course, signage as well. No loitering, moving away, people moving away or being notified to move away. So psychological barriers as well as physical barriers. And of course, CCTV to monitor those actions, one for safety, but also defensibility of your actions if we need to go back and look at those tapes. to see what your personnel did or didn't do. So we close with these ideas then, and these are the ideas I do encourage you to take home to friends and family tonight that are just about the individual safety. And some of these, as I said, just as when I work with organizations, I say, let's talk about your workplace violence plan. Tell me what you're going to do in a shot's fired. We're going to run, hide, fight. Excellent. What are you going to do if someone's throwing a chair, some protesters are caving in the windows at the front of your building? How do you handle that? I haven't thought about that. So what are the things we need to share with employees, with the individual, to make them safe in this situation? If you know it's coming, if this is something that's going to be going on for weeks, like at Zuccotti Park in Manhattan, carrying their ID, of course, you saw going back and forth with the financial district, also their cell phone, which most people have on them, a small flashlight. If they do need to signal, if they're pushed down in the crowd, if they're stuck out late and can't get back, there's a number of different motivations and logic to the flashlight. Comfortable shoes, they should be tie-on shoes. In a protest, in a large crowd, you're smushed in with people, the person behind you steps on the back of your foot, your shoe's off, that's a problem, agreed? It's a bigger problem when the person in front of you steps back now, and they're on your toes, and they can't move either. And they're going to be, I guarantee it, a lot bigger than you are. Just the way it works. Hey, I can't move. Get off my foot. And they just can't. The shoes are likely to come off real quick if they're slip-ons, if there's something, again. I'm coming into this season where people are wearing open-toe shoes and so forth is a risk. Watch out for anything that can be snagged in the crowd. So the tie, the lanyard, the earrings, something that's long and dangly. And again, in general, your risk increases the further you are in the crowd. So try to stay out of it. There's a way to walk around the crowd. Walk around it. Don't go through it. We'll talk about what to do if you do get caught in the crowd in a moment. If you're representing that company and you're the focal point of that protest, your employees should be prepared to get some taunts. You're part of the 1%, to be spit on, to be yelled at. And remember, part of the protest mentality is to get a response out of you, to create potentially a photo opportunity, to show your company's bad behavior. Do not stand against temporary structures like a stage that may collapse. We've seen this happen. Do not stand against solid immovable objects like a wall or a door, because if the crowd crushes redirected to you, there's no give. You want to leave yourself some buffer, some space there. And if you are caught up in the crowd, you're caught dead center in this very powerful physical crowd moving. Now, guys, again, this is not just violent protest. This is ball game. This is concert. This is a shopping event. This is any sort of large crowd. Don't sit down. Don't stand still. Keep moving with the crowd. If you drop something, unless it's absolutely critical, let it go. Because when you go down low to get that, the people way back, they keep coming. They don't know that sudden gap was you bending over to pick up your cell phone, and you're going to be plowed right under. So unless it's something critical, leave it go. And if you do get knocked down or pushed down, keep crawling with the crowd. Just keep moving with them. Now, one thing you have in your advantage, because you live and work in the Northeast, is you all go to the beaches, you go to the shore, and you know how to swim in the ocean, right? And they tell you if you swim in the ocean, if you're caught in a riptide, what are you supposed to do? You go parallel to the beach. You don't fight it. It'll exhaust you and drag you down. You don't let it take you because you don't know how far out it will take you. You go parallel across it until you break out from its strength. In a large group or crowd, you do the same. You slowly and diagonally push your way to the outside of the crowd where the force is less and you can escape that crowd. Don't fight it. Don't let them take you. Work to the side. If you're pushed down, as I said, try to get back as quick as you can, because now it's not just your toes that may be stepped on, it's your fingers. You may be pinned to the ground. Try to get up quickly. If you can't, get up. As I said, crawl. If you can't even crawl, duck and cover, curl up into a ball, protect those vital airways until you get back on your feet. In closing, as I said in my opening statement, most group and crowd scenarios are peaceful, perfectly legitimate, but simply because the presence of those psychological and those physical factors change the risk equation, this is something, especially due to the advent of social media, that we're seeing more of and has a greater potential of risk for your organization. I hope you never have to use a single thing I've shared with you today, but thank you all so much for your attention, and I welcome any questions if there are any. Very good. Thanks, everybody.
We may have some questions on the phone. Fred, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Do you have questions from the
one in the
virtual audience? Oh, we have one here.
Yes, in Ferguson, St. Louis County government website, which is a denial of service attack. Do you have any guidance as far as cyber protection, storm surge, and unrest?
One thing I can, the question is about, the example the gentleman gave was about a denial of service attacks on the websites of St. Louis and Ferguson government. The only guidance I could give you is expect it, because very often these groups will work in partnership with other groups such as Anonymous, who are sympathetic towards the cause, and will simultaneously launch cyber sort of attacks to supplement the physical attacks on the ground. So as a way of thinking of your risks in this scenario, it is very likely that you see both physical presence and the cyber presence of the protest groups. You will all know better than I the actual cyber defenses against these attacks, but you should anticipate them. So it's a very, very legitimate question. Fred, any other questions from the remote audience?
Yeah, I've got two. The first one is at
Very
sport.
good. Thanks again, everybody.
Are you there?
I am. What's that, Fred?
We have two questions. The first one is, at sporting or entertainment events, are there any general tips for maximizing safety? Okay, for those of you still attending the webinar, this is Fred Rogers with Continuity Housing. We seem to have lost the audio connection with Ed and with Steve, so we're going to stand by here for a moment and see if we can get them back. In the meantime, if you have any questions you'd like to ask about the presentation, go ahead and ask those now using the questions field in your control panel. And if you'll just bear with us for one more minute, I've just got a text from Ed, and they are logging back in, and they're going to get the audio reestablished. So we've got two more questions, and then we've got a short wrap-up at the end, a very short wrap-up. So we'll be done shortly, probably the next 5 or 6 minutes.
Stadium, and it was the most well-behaved crowd. Everybody was, they grew.
Okay, we can hear you. Are you there?
Yeah, we're back. Sorry.
Okay, I've got actually now 3 questions. Go ahead and roll those now. The first one is from John. He wants to know, will any of the presentation material be available online? And I can answer that. Yeah, John, I will send a follow-up email out later this afternoon. It might be in the morning, probably today, and it will include the PowerPoint presentation and also a link to the recording of this presentation. The next question, at sporting or entertainment events, are there any tips for maximizing safety?
There's a few. Actually, I'm trying to think of the name of the organization. I think it's NC4. There's a lot done in the sports and entertainment industry that publishes some very, very good guidelines If you were to do a simple web search of that, there's some very good standards in their industry. Some of the things they think about, though, which I think will be common sense, are things like communications, that signage, that verbal communication and otherwise be very prevalent and very ubiquitous. When we were offline for a few moments, I gave the example of, at least in my opinion, thinking that Disney does such a great job with crowd management. And one of the things you'll notice if you're moving through a Disney park is things like wait times for rides are very well publicized, so people have an idea what to anticipate. When people don't get clear instructions, obviously it's subject to a lot of interpretation and a lot of creativity, and that gives rise to problems. But one of the things that I would share about sporting events that we've learned, and really I guess applies to all of our domains, is that it's very helpful to have briefings for your team, for your staff, if not outright trainings and practice of their role and the things they're going to be expected to do in a crowd response. Not in terms of personal safety, but in terms of crowd management, well before the event. Some of what I've shared with you is kind of common sense. Some of it's counterintuitive. But unless you've kind of been in this environment of that large crowd, it can be hard for the individual to really anticipate what their own reaction is going to be. So it's really worth putting people through at least tabletop exercises. So signage, anticipation of different peak times, what time people are coming in, what time they go. There should be separate entrances for your team to a large sporting event, so they're not waiting in line and going in with the regular crowd. They have rally points if something goes wrong. They know where to meet outside of the crowd. I'll give you an example. It's been my last example on this topic, this one question. Working with the Secret Service around the President's inaugurations, the big gatherings on the Mall, they and other law enforcement agencies tell us that they could, in most instances, not even hear their radios, not even hear their own communications when the crowd is that big, even when the crowd is behaving. So is it important to have not just redundant forms of communication, but maybe even some really creative kind of communications like silent hand signals and so forth for your personnel, because you simply may not be relying on voice communications by cell phone or radio. So there's a lot of small things we've learned in large sporting event venues, like getting ready for the Super Bowl and such. I had the good fortune of working with the security team at MetLife Stadium and preparing for the Giants or the Super Bowl at the Giants Stadium a few years ago. And we kind of, again, were able to learn from all the prior Super Bowls about the things that worked well and didn't. And some of these, as I said, are training up your personnel and getting them a very high level of readiness before a crowd, if that's at all possible. You got other questions, though?
Yes, we have one more. Alexis wants to know, crowd management is a local issue, and today is the 2-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. Do you find that cities that experience crowd-related tragedies learn lessons and, more importantly, remember the lessons of such events?
I think they remember them. I think that they learn lessons, but like many lessons, they have a short shelf life, and people can fall back into bad habits. The reason I say that is when I look at the way some of our major cities have responded to large groups, crowds, and mobs, you would think that they hadn't learned anything because they seem to repeat some mistakes on occasion. That's true of some. There's a lot of good examples of cities that have learned. New York and LA in particular have developed very sophisticated crowd management approaches, have trained personnel to be in those crowds, to know what to look for hot spots and help extinguish them early. So some of these organizations in some cities, and I was thinking about a crowd intelligence officer I worked with just a few weeks ago from Glendale, Arizona, and just how sophisticated their intelligence section has become about crowd behavior. So some jurisdictions have done a great job in learning those lessons, applying those lessons, and improving on them. But I wouldn't say that's universal. There's some folks who seem kind of destined to repeat the same mistakes.
Okay. Steve, why don't you go ahead and advance to that very last slide so that they can see your information in case they want to get in touch with you.
So we get the slides for any questions. Thank you, everybody. And if you need to reach me, you have that. Then I'll be on your handouts and the slides you receive as well. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your attention.
Fred, it's Ed. Just want to say thank you to you and to Gianna, Steve. Great presentation. Thank you so much. Stick around for a minute. Don't leave. I know you put your coat on, but we've got more for you.
Beat the crowd.
Beat the crowd.
Be at the front of the crowd.
Continuity Housing, we want to thank them. They're the proud sponsors of these webinars, and this one in particular was just terrific. Please remember to visit continuityhousing.com. Leave a comment in the survey if you're interested in how they can provide your critical employees guaranteed housing when they need it most. Please do send me, Gianna, or Fred a note with any topics or speakers that you'd like to see in the future for these webinars, and be sure to watch the ACP website for future webinar information. As a reminder, this and previous webinars are recorded and made available on the website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think who might benefit from it. And you'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email, along with additional information on the topical content. And finally, you'll get a very brief survey about this webinar when you close your browser. Please do take half a minute to answer the questions, because it really helps us refine our productions for you. Thank you, and have a great day.